And then we'll call this server address, like we did before. And once again, pretty much the same parameters. The family is going to stay as AF INET. The IP, the actual address, is going to stay as any address, because both of these connections are going to be on the local machine. We want them to actually connect to each other. And then we'll use the same port, 9002, I believe. We need to call the same function to convert the data format of the port. It'll be 9002. And then finally, the actual address. We're using this inaddr any constant, which basically will resolve to any IP address on the local machine. So once we've done that, we can call the bind function in almost the exact same way as we called the connect function. So that'll look like this. So first we pass the socket. And then we cast our address in the exact same way that we did before. And then finally, the last parameter will once again be the size of the server address. So now our socket is bound to an IPM port, so we can listen for connections using the listen function. So we call the listen function to start listening for connections. That function takes our server socket. And then the second argument is actually a backlog, which is how many connections can be waiting essentially for this particular socket at one point in time. Since we know we're only going to be using this with one particular client program, we can set this number to whatever. It doesn't really matter so long as it's at least one. Or I'm going to use 5 here, but it shouldn't matter what you use, really. This might be important if you start writing network applications that have to deal with lots of traffic. But in this case, this is a small example, so this number doesn't really matter. And then finally, we're now going to create an integer to hold a client socket, because once we are able to listen for connections, we can start actually accepting connections. And when you accept a connection, what we get back is the client socket that we're then going to write to. So then we call this accept function and set the return value equal to our client socket. So now we'll get the socket that we can do whatever we want with. So the client socket will be equal to the result of the accept function. So when we're able to listen for connections, we accept a connection, and after we've accepted that connection, we get back a socket that allows us to manipulate anything on the client side. So we now have a two-way connection with the client and server. We can both send and receive data both ways. So in order to accept, our first parameter is the socket that we are accepting connections on. That's our server socket. And then the next two parameters we're not going to fill in. I'm going to pass null into both of them. but they are structures that would contain the address of the client connection. The first parameter is, anyway, a structure and then a size for an address of the client. So if you want to figure out where your client is connecting from, you can pass a structure into here, and it will fill up the data of that particular structure, similar to the socket address that we did for binding the actual socket. It'll fill that data up with information about where this connection is coming from. But since we know and we don't really need this information, it's not interesting to us because it's just our local machine, I'm going to leave these both as null. So now we have a client socket that we can send data to. So let's send the message that we defined earlier to our client socket. So the send call looks like this. We first pass the socket that we're sending data on. That's the first parameter. The second thing that we need to send is the actual data that we want to send to this particular client socket. Since we have our server message variable already defined, we can send that. And then we need to specify the size of the message. And we can do that with the size of function on our server message. And then I believe there's also an optional flags parameter here as well, which we won't need for this case. So once we've done that, we've finished our server application and we can close the socket. So now once we've got this running, we should have a two-way connection between the client and server. And we can test this with two terminal windows and make sure everything works appropriately. So let's do that. So now I've split the screen into two parts. On the left-hand side, we're going to have a terminal window that runs the TCP server program that we've just compiled. I just did that with make. So after you're done with the code, you can compile it by using make and then TCP server. Mine is already up to date. And the same thing for the client now that we're done with the code. So they're both compiled and up to date now. So first I'm going to start the TCP server. So as you can see, on the right side, we got the data printed out, the message that the server was sending out to any clients that connected. And on the left side, nothing happened. We don't have any output from our server. No error messages or anything like that. So as you can see, what we've been able to do here is make a low-level network connection over the TCP protocol between two sockets and be able to communicate back and forth. With the functions that we looked at, like send and receive, we can actually send data both ways. We can both send data to the server and receive data from the server, and the same on the client side, we can both send and receive data. So this is how we create a basic low-level network communication setup between two applications. And what we'll look at in the next lesson is how we can start implementing some of the higher-level protocols, like HTTP, for instance. If we want to request particular web pages, we can build it on top of the framework that we've already started with these particular clients, using the same set of calls and just a few changes. We can make an application that will request and return to us the results from any web page on the internet. So this is the basics of setting up socket programming in C. We've looked at both client and server interaction and communication. If you are running these examples on Linux and have further questions about any of the functions that we've looked at so far, I would advise you to take a quick look at the manual pages. They give a lot of detail and information about any of the functions that we looked at. If you just type man and then the name of one of the functions, you'll get a page describing the parameters. For instance, here we can look at the one for socket. And we have a documentation page describing in a lot of detail more of what each of the parameters are for the socket function, what all of them do, and what the things here specify. So for more information, you can take a look at these pages for any of the functions that we've looked at so far. That's it for this lesson.